Okay, guys, how's everything? Have you received the comments on the formative essays and everything is okay? Yeah. Just like make sure if you have if you need to discuss the comments, like fix an appointment with me in order to discuss this during my office hours. Okay? Yeah. So this week we are tackling, the gender issues and gender norms and politics in the Middle East. So hopefully we are going to cover the theoretical part and the empirical part in this lecture, and then in the seminar we are going to tackle diversity in Islamic context. We have like 3 pieces that cover Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Iran, and we'll build on the discussions or the point I'm going to, the message I'm going to get it across in this lecture. So we'll start out with Orientalism and women representation in the Western culture. How actually Muslim woman as like a cultural icon occupies a central position in the Western culture or Orientalist discourse. And then we will offer like a critical overview of the major theoretical approaches that actually address the issue of women oppression in the Middle East: Modernization Theory, Dependency Theory, and radical feminism or feminist approaches that actually have been central part of the social theory in throughout the 60s and 70s. And then how the critique of modernity and post-structuralism offer alternative conceptualization of feminism and offer different analytical overview or analytical angles through which, or different lens through which we can address women issues or women oppression in the Middle East. We will cover this anti-imperialist feminism or decolonialism, the approaches of decolonialism, and what's the main premises of this trend. And then the developmental studies and transnational feminism, in particular focus on socioeconomic factors and elements. And then Islamic modernism and Muslim feminism, and we are going to see whether or not it's an oxymoron, like to speak of like Muslim feminism. And then how we can develop, or push for more complex understanding of women issue or like women oppression in the Middle East. So we are trying to cover the state policy or the state discourses and the state institutions, and to what extent this would affect or define the gender ideology and shape gender policies as well. So we are tackling, the state in relation to gender from 2 main perspectives: discourse, like how, symbols of woman or gendered image, of nation and women appeared in the state and the official discourses historically and recently, and institutionally during the processes of state building, how the legal or the lawmaking processes that affected, the position of women in family with regard to the personal code and family law as well. So we are taking this from state discourse and institutional elements, and then the agency of women and to what extent this reappropriated gender role and gender norms in times of war and peace in the Middle East. Yeah. And then we are going to contextualize diversity in Islam. And this is I'll touch upon this point here, and we're going to discuss further in the seminar with 3 pieces that actually cover 3 different contexts, like Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. Okay, guys, from your last semester, what's Orientalism? Yeah, Ali?
The depiction of Western scholars, how they depict the Middle East upon their own, thoughts.
Yeah, Bertie?
Perception and representation of the Middle East that basically focuses on how the Middle East is everything that the West is not, so irrational, very backwards.
Yeah. So it's more than a perception. It's kind of a monopoly or a dominant position of knowledge production that they claim. They have this powerful and dominant position, and they have this monopoly over truth and knowledge production about the depiction of the Orient. And according to this depiction, they created kind of academically and institutionally in media and academic institutions as well, and ideologically. So this depiction is like, you know, both are distinctly like, or ontologically and essentially two different civilizations. And the Orient is kind of exotic culture, and it's backward and uncivilized and traditional. And like on the other side, the Western or civilization is modern, civilized, and developed. Okay, so the like woman is like, or Muslim woman actually as a cultural icon occupies a central position in this discourse and this mysterious and exotic culture. Like woman oppression and subjugation, you know, these are like, you know, the images or the main depiction of the Muslim woman in the Orientalist discourse. So if I ask you, what's like the general image about Muslim women in Western culture? You guys, like, this is like, feel free to discuss. Yeah.
Always wearing.
Nothing would be personal about it. I didn't touch upon this topic, you know, since like 10 years or something like that. This is the last time I talked about, you know, feminism and Muslim feminism, but it's okay. Just nothing is personal. Yeah, feel free. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just like the picture shows, they always wear the abaya, the black clothes.
Sorry?
They're always wearing the abaya.
Yeah, hijab or the veiling. Yeah.
And they are commonly under depression or less empowerment in politics and society.
Yeah. So what's in this picture here? It actually captures, you know, it depicts, you know, perfectly the position of women in Western culture. Anyone? Yeah, Firas?
Walking behind the man, following.
Yeah, so this is like Munira Charad actually mentioned, like gaze lowered, wrapped in a veil, walk 10 steps behind a man, walking in his shadow, and in doing so becoming a shadow herself. So that's what one of my students wrote in describing images of Muslim women in popular culture in the United States. Okay, and this is like, you know, the position or the very image or the portrayal of women oppression in the Middle East, in Western culture or in the Western discourse. And of course, Islam, you know, lies at the core of this depiction as like a monolithic structure that actually shaping women conditions, you know, in the same way in all places. And this is what we're going to see, you know, here in the lecture and the seminar, how context is very important, and to what extent we can depict, you know, Islam as a monolithic structure or system that actually shapes women condition in the same way. And like this depiction of women oppression, it actually it was used in order to justify interventionist policies in the Middle East and this discourse of democratic reform and liberation in the Middle East. And this is how the U.S. or the United States foreign policy after September 11 actually tackled or addressed, you know, the woman issue in order to sell, you know, this discourse of Middle Eastern reform and democratic reform in the Middle East. It appeared in the Middle East Partnership Initiative and the broader Middle East and North Africa. Some of and this is actually pretty much related to not only to the discourse, but actually like the policy making and the mental image in Western culture as Muslim woman as a singular identity. It's elimination of any kind of self-understanding, self-expression. It's a complete kind of elimination of individuality. So that's why they use Muslim woman as a one word in order to get, you know, this message across about, you know, this monolithic identity that actually captures, you know, very well the subjugation and the oppression of women, Muslim women in the Middle East. And to be fair to the argument, some scholars from the Middle East, they are totally absorbed into, you know, this kind of discourse of modernization, and they repeat, this kind of Orientalist discourse. And this is actually what appeared in the Arab Human Development Report in 2005. They actually reiterated, the religious and the poor cultural conditions that they actually pinpoint this as the main cause of women disempowerment in the Middle East. Okay? And this is like what Layla Abu Lughd was critical of, and this is what we are going to discuss further. So starting with the major theoretical approaches that interrogated, women oppression in the Middle East. What do you think about the modernization theory? Anyone? What are the main premises or assumptions here?
If you modernize the Middle East, then you will liberate the women.
It's basically they depart from this dichotomous, vision and view of societies, modern and tradition. They see this in binaries like traditional and modern, and there is kind of linear progression from traditional societies to modern society, and the state is the main agent that would bring about, this kind of social changes through relegating, the traditional forces or Islamic clergy to the margin, and through this kind of institutional setting or legal construct or legal frameworks. This would modernize, the status of Muslim women in the Middle East through introducing different kind of education and different kind of services and different kind of favorable laws and legal frameworks. This would actually improve the position or eliminate the oppression of Muslim women in the Middle East. So actually, and again, Islam as a traditional construct or traditional culture was the main cause that actually responsible for this kind of oppression of Muslim women in the Middle East. So any criticism to these theoretical assumptions? Yeah?
Just in general, because there is a contradiction between the previous perception of Orientalism, of the Oriental woman as overly sexualized, overly as a generator, and when Europe or the West was became more modernized, then the narrative shifted to appease first of all to show the other as an opposite, and also to
Yeah, so you're trying to say there is kind of an idealization of Western culture and the position of women in Western culture. And this is what decolonial and post-colonial approaches actually, this is the point they departed from in order to criticize, this vision or this position and this stand towards modernization or any kind of repackaging of the main assumptions of modernization theory. Any, theoretically speaking, any kind of critique you can offer to these theoretical premises or assumptions?
I mean,
Ali and then Burton, okay? Yeah.
Can be problematic because some gender issues that are present in the Middle East can be related to structural factors or economic factors rather than culture or religion.
Yeah? Burton?
Also assumes that there's a certain trajectory that we will follow.
Yeah, it's only a linear progression, and this didn't happen given even the examples that the United States intervened in order to liberate and emancipate and save women in Afghanistan. This actually led to more added to their marginalization and vulnerability in these societies. But theoretically speaking, it's kind of this depiction of fixed oppositional binaries. It actually glossed over, the processes of reconstruction of the meaning and values and norms in different societies over, different time periods, theoretically speaking. And depicting the state as the main, agent in order to introduce or to advance these kind of modern social changes, it actually neglected, the other factors, as we are going to see, how like certain kind of political alliances and allegiances actually led to more conservative family laws that actually perpetuated, the kinship solidarities and patrilineal kinship. And it's not like, the responsibility for the state in order to bring about these kind of modernized, legal framework. It actually did the opposite to the woman position and the woman status in these societies, in some societies. The dependency theory, any take on the main assumptions? Dependency in relation to woman oppression? Yeah, it actually perceived, this kind of oppressive, position, or the oppressive conditions, of women, Muslim women in the Middle East through the lens of economic determinism, and pretty much like Marxist analysis throughout, like, through tracing these processes of historical development and the emergence of comprador class that actually aligned themselves with the colonial power or the colonial capitalist. This actually led to not only class oppression, but actually sexist oppression as well during the colonial period, and the colonial period that actually transformed women into cheap labor or only consumerist, or the fundamentally consumerist agent. So actually they speak of kind of patriarchal class oppression rather than like this kind of the mode of production. It's pretty much Marxist analysis, like, the mode of production, which is capitalist, the infrastructural condition of the capitalist mode of production and accumulation and exploitation. It actually led to the oppression of women. And like the superstructure, which is like Islamic culture and other norms and values, they actually came next. Like the first and foremost, it was like, economic factors and this kind of superstructure that would, infrastructural conditions that would actually lead to this oppressive conditions of women, rather than like cultural and other social norms. So actually for them, the only way out for women liberation or women emancipation, it has to be part and parcel of this socialist transformation and part and parcel of the movement towards, like, this socialist transformation in order to liberate, the economy from these exploitative capitalist forces and the oppression of women as well. Any criticism to this theoretically? So first of all, it's like a Marxist analysis. So it's like endorsing this crude form of class analysis. It actually reproduced this economic determinism, and it failed to depict, the specificity of certain nations, of cultural and national processes that actually would bring about these kind of oppression based on cultural and normative and value system that actually permeated these societies. So it actually failed to depict, the role of Islam, as we are going to see, as an ideology or as like a legal construct that can be instrumentalized and used in order to oppress women in certain contexts. Okay, so it actually failed to make this kind of general assumptions about, national and cultural processes in different nations. Okay, so it might be applied like it made like this kind of general assumptions rather than depiction of certain contexts or specificity of certain nations where certain like cultural factors and norms in society reproduce this patriarchal structure and led to more oppression of women, including, Muslim women. So another like criticism here, it's kind of by pushing, Islam outside of these kind of social relations. It's part of this superstructure that it's like, secondary, like it played like, a non-central role in oppressing women. It further like essentialized, Islam by pushing this out of the social relations rather than bringing this in order to see how different contexts or instrumentalization of religion might actually lead to women oppression in certain contexts. And by this idealization of socialist transformation, the proponents of dependency theory actually failed to depict, some patriarchal practices in some socialist society. by idealizing, the vision of social society, it actually neglected or denied the fact that women actually can face some sort of oppression and subjugation in some socialist societies. Okay? Like feminist approaches or radical feminism, they focused mainly on the conception of male dominance and patriarchy in different societies, including, the Middle East, that this is the main cause of the oppression and subjugation of women in the Middle Eastern countries. So this actually grafted onto, like, the concept actually was used by different, by different strands of social theory in order to highlight or to investigate the oppressive conditions, that women faced in these societies, either in like economic domain or even in personal and social relations. And of course, like, the role of Islam is central, to this approach or to these theorists as well. It was like more or less like repackaging, of modernization and enlightenment assumption, that it's kind of like Western, feminism that can play, the role of the savior of women in the Middle East by liberating them and foreclosing other possibility of emancipation, in other terms other than Western culture. It's only by endorsing, the main assumptions of Western culture, which is like basically secularism and individualism or autonomy, like individual autonomy and physical and financial autonomy of women, and elimination of any kind of gender role. This is the only way of emancipation of women, and it's their like mission in order to play, this role of the role of savior, of oppressed women in the Middle East. What's the main criticism, to this? It's kind of remaking again, it's like reiterating or replicating the main assumption of modernization theory in different forms, and this kind of idealization of Western culture, or remaking the entire world according to one single cultural vision. It actually neglected, the contradictions actually inherited or lied in this culture on the one hand, and the contradictions, the transplantation or the implementation of this culture in different contexts might bring about, negative or might be associated with different harms or harmful consequences, as it happened in Afghanistan. Again, this conception of salvation and female emancipation, it actually denied, this kind of self-expression and any sort of choosing, the world, or living in a world, of their choice, or fully understand the context within which these women actually made their choices, or against oppression, and what kind of other factors, social and economic, in addition to the cultural ones, that actually reproduced these oppressive conditions in these countries. Okay, so it's cultural in addition to or besides other factors. Ali?
So is the feminist Marxist approach a combination between those factors, and the one that the dependency theory can use both, actually? Because I read about feminist Marxism, but I don't know what it really is. Is it related or
to the liberal ones?
Yeah. To this approach.
These ones I meant the liberal ones, but the Marxists, they share, there are some commonalities, they share, the same kind of, but from class perspective, again, how the mode of production and exploitative, relations or the relations of production would actually affect, the women conditions. So basically, again, it's ideational versus material, as we are going to see. So I would actually put these kind of Marxist tendencies, under development and transnational feminism. But I meant here the ideational one, it's the liberal one, the liberal feminist, that actually reproduced this white supremacy and the morality and the idealization of Western culture. Okay? So So this is like how these kind of trends, including this liberal and the reproduction of liberal Western culture, actually came in for a barrage of criticism, especially from different trends of post-colonialism and anti-imperialist tendencies. So actually they departed from this kind of false assumptions about inferior others, like they are not really inferior, because departing from this sense of superiority towards the other cultures or the Middle Eastern cultures, it's kind of it should be displaced in order to understand how people assign meaning to their traditions and to their religious practices. So actually they pinpointed this moral superiority and this sense of supremacy that actually used in order to legitimize this reproduction of imperialist practices, rather than liberating women or helping women to step out of their oppressive conditions. And this is what Abu Lughd mentioned, saving involves this sense of superiority by Westerners and a lack of reflection about the violences entailed in transformations, and Afghan women might be called to personhood, so to speak, in a different language, one in which they wish to retain forms of life with a strong family ties or orient their lives towards religion. So it's again how to live in a world of their own choice. What if they did choose to have this kind of tight family ties or family bonds, and to assign different meaning as kind of they see these religious traditions and rituals as liberating, and it would offer them the emancipation of the oppression, rather than it's the opposite way around. So they deny the fact that there are other terms or other ways of social change or achieving goals other than Western culture or the main premises of the Western culture. So, but again here, what's inherently flawed, with this term of universalism? Because they offer critique, to this universal feminist approach, which is some sort of liberal, feminist approach as well, or ideational.
I mean, for them, the ideal universal norm is what norms are, what Western norms are, and they cite as the ideal and the universal. Therefore,
Yeah.
There's a difference, culture and ideology is not being taken into consideration, and the role of women generally in the Middle East is being very different to what it is in Europe.
Yeah, it's again they have this mental construct or ideal imagery about the world they are going to save oppressed women too, as Laila Abdul mentioned, saving from, it entails kind of saving too as well, in order to make them to push them to step out of their oppressive conditions, in order to make their own, not their own, or to push them towards certain directions, or only way in order to achieve their or to fulfill the goal of salvation and emancipation. It's only through this universal norms of liberal ideologies or Western culture. Okay, but again, so what post-colonial critique or anti-imperialist tendencies they mention, you don't need to abandon altogether this conception of universalism. It's only about how to define woman oppression. Here, for example, through by defining this as universalist opposition to sexist oppression. So it's a universal norm that all feminists or all proponents or feminism would agree on. So this is how to act or to organize efforts in order to eradicate the causes or the effect of sexist oppression, which is a systemic disadvantage that women might face, or based on a specific gender system, or based on by virtue of membership in a specific gender system. So that's why by adopting what actually Carol mentioned, she mentioned something about non-idealist universalism. like how to achieve like gender equality and gender justice, but based on a thorough examination and understanding of some contextual realities of these countries in order not to bring about consequential harm or harmful effect of certain intervention. So by agreeing on like, a definition, of what feminists, would care about, what's gender equality or gender justice, actually means, and then by adopting, these kind of normative understanding or these kind of non-ideal universal norms, so they can act upon conditions, that actually would account for or the main cause of women oppression in the Middle East. So instead of like, abandoning this altogether because it's feminism as a concept, as an like imperialist imposition or imperialist project, or actually accepting, this kind of like chauvinist, Western tendencies, and working within, the parameters and the boundaries, they actually fixated or laid down upon feminist organizations or other like, proponents of feminists, so they can have their kind of alternative course of action in order to eliminate the effect and the causes of feminist oppression. And in order to do that, she suggested, this kind of epistemic shift, against imperial idealization and morality. Because they based, the whole assumptions are based on this like idealization of Western culture and this moral superiority. By assuming that you actually relegating or pushing, Western culture out of like, any kind of criticism, so it's no longer a target, of criticism. So you bring this back in, and you have to place it in a position that can be that this Western culture can be criticized, first of all, and then how can you offer kind of normative theorization of the position of feminists and women, Muslim women or women in the Middle East, based on thorough, like, contextual information, and based on not only like ideological and philosophical prescriptions, but also how these ideas and norms actually function, in real world, because people assign different meaning to values, to norms that actually you need to fully understand first before you theorize, normatively theorize about women in the Middle East. Okay? I'm going to explain this in some detail. So, like for the critique of Western culture, so this is like you need to start out with how like the Western forces or Western countries actually they generate some sort of benefits out of this subjugation rather than assuming any kind of savior role or assuming the role of the saving woman in the Middle East. So this is like instead of and some Marxists, they would say like, or some left-leaning, feminism, you need like to pinpoint or to bring out, this kind of global economic structure that would account for social injustices in these countries and shape the world and the state policies women can find themselves, in these countries. So how to tackle or to address, this kind of unjust, global conditions could be economic or could be like, political. And this kind of unjust conditions, it shaped, the world of the woman in the Middle East and actually the state policies that actually affected, the gender life or women lives in the Middle East. And basically there are like a lot of writings about, this cost of morality and moralism by investigating, the practices of American troops in Iraq against women and Afghanistan as well. So there is kind of a cost entailed, it's not only moral superiority. So instead of filtering out information, so you need to frame again, these practices in order to highlight and to offer some sort of criticism to these, to the culture. And exposing, these contradictions, of decontextualization, how the application of certain, elements of Western culture in different contexts or in different societies would bring about negative effects and would have like some sort of harmful consequences. For example, like, financial independence in some societies actually would lead to feminization of responsibility. Anyone can elaborate on this? Yeah, it's mainly like some men would rely heavily on women if they generate funds, so they are not going to provide for the family, and they will rely on women in order to provide for the family. If there is kind of certain set of like gender role in these societies, or a system of gender role, so this kind of financial independence might have, you need to understand, doesn't mean like, financial independence is something like inherently wrong, but you need to understand these contexts. In Egypt, for example, in some slum areas, like women got integrated in informal structure, and actually men depended heavily on women. They are financially independent, but it didn't lead to their emancipation, or it didn't eradicate the causes of their oppression, okay? So some sort of like women, if you can understand doing, ethnography, for example, you can ask women in certain societies, they do believe in this complementarity or complementary gender system, like men would provide for the family and they will take care of the household. They believe in this, and they find like, some sort of liberation and emancipation. They didn't face any kind of injustice or oppression in this. So this is what they believe in, so this is their own choice. So what post-colonial or decolonial approaches might say, you need to understand the context, and if there are any sort of injustice, you need to do to advance some sort of justice-enhancing policies or justice-enhancing, intervention, and instead of like implementing, policies or creating, ideal image about, what's like gender equality and gender justice means, it actually means nothing, in these kind of contexts. So it's a matter of like, their own choices, and they might, participate in other forms, of feminized power, like village, councils. They might have a say, in decision making, but Western feminists might consider this like a legitimate source of power, because it actually occurs, in sites that are outside of the public institutions. So they don't affect, the state level policies, but they have a say, in certain, some sort of decision-making centers in their villages or in their context. So the point here, how to bring context, in the analysis. In order to normatively theorize about others or women in the global south, so it's not like, you don't need, to choose between this kind of ethnocentrism and cultural relativism. Anyone, what's cultural relativism is? Yeah, it's basically like, yeah, Burton?
It's basically that every culture is the same, right? So you're trying to observe a culture from that perspective, but then also compare it, but not like take a position from some superior studies.
It's an improvement on this like racism and ethnocentrism, like, conception of liberal feminism or ideational feminism, but it entails like it's their culture and it's not my own job to judge. Like it entails kind of passivity, like, you don't take an action in order to improve this. It's an outcome, of a long process, historical processes that actually brought about, these kind of oppressive conditions, but I have nothing to do, towards them. So I don't, and the thing is, like, this is what Layla Beloud mentioned, it's kind of complicity of some sort of anthropologist that actually, they mentioned something like about these kind of cultural, they buy into this cultural relativism by relegating some sort of the colonial heritage and the colonial history that actually led to some sort of oppression. So they disentangle, these kind of cultural, or highlight, they highlight these cultural differences as a separate, domain, culture as a separate domain from these historical processes that actually triggered or brought about, these cultural conditions that are oppressive, of women in these societies. So the thing is, like here, it's in order to theorize, you have to bring, context back into the analysis to gather some sort of information in order to fully understand the context within which, the women are oppressed. And from this standing point, you need to understand how political ideologies and moral philosophies actually function in real world or in social life, and how people would assign meaning and values, to these ideological and philosophical elements. And from these, like, you can come up with a notion of gender equality and to recommend some sort of policies in order to eradicate the main reasons of women oppression. Like in development studies, and transnational feminism, they focus mainly on social and economic factors, how women would generate some sort of, how to include women, in developmental projects in order to help them generate income. What are the obstacles that actually hinder women from entering or accessing labor market, and gaining, some sort of position, position in the labor market in order to generate funds and in order to eliminate any kind of exploitative, position in social and economic production in these societies. So the thing is here, they marginalize, the cultural factors, and they focus more on social and economic factors, historically and some historical and contemporary social political processes and modalities, of participation in economic life. Here in Egypt, for example, Tucker mentioned 4 interlocking determinants that would account for the submissive position or subordinate position of women in Egypt in the 19th century. So you need to highlight to what extent, to investigate the land tenure and how this led to, a feminization, of poverty. Women didn't have access to capital, they didn't play a role in economic and social reproduction, and barely, a few women, they have, access to movable properties because of, this kind of contestation and inheritance law. And you need to highlight, their participation in social production and position in family unit, whether or not they can arrange their own marriage, whether or not they are financially independent. All of these factors would determine, the position of women in society and in family unit or in the household as well. And the prevailing ideological definition of women role, for example, in rural areas or villages in Egypt, if women actually abandoned, their their care, of household, and they have this position in labor market, it would consider this as kind of unfit mother or unfit woman in their societies. So how prevailing ideologies, including cultural norms and value system, even Islamic laws and Islamic Islamic regulations and Islamic rules, juxtaposition, of these cultural factors together with the structural and economic ones would determine, women's position in certain societies. Okay? Transnational feminism, some people would actually put this under the rubric of anti-colonial or decolonial, but they basically highlight, this oppression or oppressive conditions of globalization and neoliberal policies, and they examine possibilities, of cross-border activism in order to enhance, the position, or they actually focus on the social and economic implications, of globalization processes and neoliberal policies, with their repercussions and implications for women's position in their societies. So it's kind of still decolonial, but they focus on social and economic aspects. Islamic modernism and Muslim feminism, we are going to discuss this later. I'm going just to touch upon this here. So basically, they focus on, they started, some women, they start to give another rereading, of the religious scriptures or religious texts by focusing on the conception of a state and citizenship, or they offer kind of different interpretation in order to supersede, this patriarchal interpretation, of Quran and Sunnah or Prophet Muhammad Hadith. So they actually, they think that they can bring about some sort of changes and political and social goals from within the Islamic framework and from rereading or reinterpreting, the text. And they derive their agency and strength from these Islamic traditions rather than the very conception of a successful individual, autonomous individual that would actually achieve their goals through Western culture. And some of them, they highlight, the gender, they actually reconstruct, different concepts about equality, between different human beings, and they reappropriate this in relation or reconstruct these values in relation to gender in order to highlight, how religious or Islamic texts actually emphasized gender equality or the egalitarian values. And they offer, some sort of indigenous resistance, against Western agenda. So they actually pushed back against, these kind of radical sexualization from liberal or Marxist, like, how, like, this conception of liberal or freedom. And again, like, the position of the veil or the headscarf or the hijab is very central to these arguments in the Western popular imagination and conservative imagination alike. So that's why they try, as I remember, some of the, like, Muslim feminists, I think Zainab al-Ghazali, but I can't remember, I hardly remember it was a talk or it's a written word. She highlighted, rather than like this kind of modesty, it's kind of private, what kind of meaning I think she gave like a different meaning to, and to be fair, like, some few male preachers as well. They mentioned something about taqwa or protection of heart, and how this kind of privatization of sexuality would actually protect, the family unit or the family institution, and like, they offer, some sort of this taqwa, to Muslim women as well. So they try to introduce kind of meaning or reinterpretation, of this, and others actually they see this as a patriarchal interpretation, of the text, and they refuse some of the Muslim feminists, and they refuse, the meaning, the hijab. But it depends on the context and the meaning, they assign to this. And we're going to discuss this further in the seminar. So here, like, the writings, in the Middle East, they focus on Islam and ideational elements, but some of them, they actually pushed, the debates outside of the Islamic and cultural domain, and they bring state back into the analysis in order to highlight these decades of cultural nationalism and Islamic populism, how the state actually capitalized on this, how women reappropriated their agency and gender roles and norms in different times, in times of peace and war, in anti-colonial struggle, and Kurdish women against, Daesh and ISIS, for example. This is like the most prominent or recent example. And the role of women in anti-liberation, in anti-colonial struggle or national liberation struggle as well, and how they organized, they became like part and parcel of associational life. They formed their cultural clubs, they formed their organizations in order to push for gender equality and to defend their own rights. In relation, and how the state actually shaped the gender ideology, and how the state, it's not like a gender free, how state actually molded, or used, women in order to craft an ideology or an image of nationhood or national ideology. So this is like how some writings, offer some sort of complex understanding of women issues in the Middle East by focusing on the woman representation in states, discourse, and institutions, construction of women agency in times of peace and war, and contextualizing diversity in Islam. And this is like what we are going to discuss in the seminar, the third point, okay? Here, starting from the discourse or the institutional representation of women. So here, like, women as a symbol, of nations. The state actually used gendered image of nation in order to craft or to create this collective image, of nationhood. For example, in Egypt, they used like, this kind of a struggle between different parties and different political forces over, the identity of the state, whether it's pretty much related to pharaohs or to Islam and Islamic identity. So it depends on this kind of struggle between different forces. They produced, this kind of gender or maternal, imagery about the nation. So, like, for example, like, celebrating, this kind of anti-colonial or anti-autonomy, anti-Ottoman legacy. So they actually they did take pride in this peasantry history by depicting or portraying, Egypt as a peasant woman with the veil. Here you see like. So this is like how to depict and using, the woman, in order to craft a vision or to instill, this collective imagery of nationhood. And it's pretty much related to, again, like, they relate this, like, this kind of gender image. It's when they did envision, the nation as a mother or as a female or as a woman. So it became like much easier for them to reappropriate, the conception of woman owner and apply this, to the national owner or the owner of the country as well. So they used this, family owner metaphor in order, what's in Arabic, it's sayr, which it has like some sort of sexual connotation. So in order to protect, this would trigger, this sense of loyalty and obedience and disgrace, towards occupier or like towards colonial authority, and would trigger, this kind of national sentiments in order to protect their countries against, rapers or against colonial authority that actually represented, transgression, against, the national owner, like, which is similar to the family owner as well. So what like, nationalist feminists actually disagreed here. They disagreed on this sexual connotation because it actually entrenched, this masculinity culture as well. Like using and celebrating, this conception of national owner, which is related to women practices and woman owner as well. So this actually entrenched, this kind of male dominant position, and the state, is kind of responsible for this kind of reproduction of or reinforcing these cultural ideas of masculinity. So they used it as well, like, figuratively. They use like woman body or as if like, they use like woman body in order to introduce some sort of vision about, how nation would achieve kind of economic progress in this family planning and birth control campaign as well. So how like depicting, like how they actually crafted, these kind of media campaign on family planning. It became like a woman individual responsibility and the well-being of the country. It's pretty much related, to how women would control over, their body in order to introduce, this or achieve this country progress and economic advancement. That was in Egypt as well. In Palestine, they use, this politicization of fertility and reproductive culture as like a form of resistance in order to foster national narrative, the Palestinian narrative against the Zionist narrative. So Israelis would consider Palestinians as productively primitive, and they themselves are productively modern. So that's why Palestinians, they actually celebrated, this peasant icon and this conception of Izwa, like clan power, like having like so many children. They actually taking pride in this, and this would became like a space for them in order or a site for negotiation and contestation. It actually, for the sake like of in order to give like a full picture, this created division, within Palestinians themselves, because it created, this division between rural and urban cultures, and some of them, they endorse, this modernity discourse as well. Like family size it's pretty much related to how educated, the family is or family members are, how modern and rural and urban, they are. So it became like kind of identity marker in order to reconceptualize, this conception of sexuality and reproductive culture in Palestine. But this is how, like, it became like woman body as well became like a site, for renegotiation and like contestation over identity marker. For the legal framework here, like, the family laws, this is how to bring the state back into the analysis. Again, like Munira Shard here mentioned in her study, on Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco. She tried to understand why Tunisia did stand out for progressive, family law, because political leaders, they didn't have this kind of alliances with tribes and patrilineal, a kinship network, that they needed, to have or maintain their own position over social order. So the state didn't have to negotiate, with these people in order to have a say in the family law and women personal law. So that's why Tunisia stands out for their progressive, family law. So the state is not a neutral agent in order to bring about modern social changes. Here, as I mentioned, Kurds, are women, combatants, in the battlefield. They reappropriated, this conception of victimhood, and they appropriated, the role. So they pushed back against this pacifist, conception about, women, shouldn't participate in war, and they should stay in home, and they are only victims, of wars, and they are only a target of aggression, rape, and violation, from men during war. So they became active participants, in the war, and they reappropriated, the gender role, and they